I understand that today's topic, Tim, is one that's a little risky for us.
Well, it's going to be enjoyable. We're going to be looking at some future prognostication and see if we can take advantage of it. Not only to make our projects better, but actually to understand how to prepare for unforeseen events.
So I bet you have a little vignette or something to kick us off with. Just I know that you
Oh,
and I have war stories up the yin yang, so let's see what.
oh boy, this actually goes back to about 93. No, it goes back to about 97 or 98. And this wasn't actually project related. Well, it was project management related. It was one of my university course professors was taking me through this course on risk. And he said, okay, guys, write down what could possibly happen in the next week. And then we did. And then he said, what's the best possible outcome? Just make it insanely good and see what you could look like. And then he said, write one down that's insanely horrible, like the world blows up in flames. And we did. And then we looked at that in context of the risk that we thought was going to happen. And then he said, those things aren't going to happen. Why did I have you write those down if they're not going to happen? And we eventually, as a class, discovered that you don't plan for, a middle road. You plan for these boundary situations that give you an understanding that if you understand these things and if you have things in place to at least respond to these crazy events, the more normal events that have like an 85 to 95% chance of occurring will be well within your ability to manage them.
So in your professor's scenario, the chance of the world blowing up tomorrow is infinitesimally small, but the chance of your database architect getting sick and being out of commission for 2 weeks is much higher. So
yeah, and also me becoming a CEO because my project management was so extremely good was also so low. I'd love that to happen too.
So what's interesting is as I was thinking about today's topic, it occurred to me that we talk about what's the most important topic with regard to risk that you think or that I may think is overlooked. Risk itself on a project is often the most overlooked aspect of a project.
There is. And when we break down risk, there's two ways we can break it down. We have the traditional characteristics, right? Probability and impact, right? That's what a risk is. Yeah. It's a potential future event. It's not real yet. And if it does occur, it will make an impact, right? Well, what's funny is there's other ways you can actually categorize risk. There's individual risk. Here's a risk here, here's a risk here, here's a risk here. And then there's something called general project risk, which is a general understanding of the project. You have to look at the risk of each three of these events and somehow combine them to understand the general risk.
Yeah, and I think, in terms of, I was being somewhat facetious, but not really. I think for so many years, and even today, so many projects, people don't take the management of risk seriously. Sometimes they'll do it because it's something to check off on their checklist for project management, but still they feel that if something occurs from a risk situation, they'll just handle it when it happens. And I think that's ahead. So short-sighted.
It's either that, that's a risk, and I'll handle it or I'll escalate it. Boom, done, right? Yeah. Well, or I'm going to estimate it and I'm going to throw a dart and boom, wherever that dart lands, that's exactly going to be the outcome of that risk. When, how, and how big, and what I need to do. And both of those are fallacies.
They are, and I harken back to my days when I did a lot of projects, and we had to bid for the projects against many worthwhile competitors. And what's interesting to me, and this is often overlooked too, in order to win the business, we had to assume that there was almost no risk. In order to, we had to come up with the most optimum situation that could occur during the project delivery so that we could, first of all, win the business. And then it's almost like a hoping game. Like, I hope nothing happens because we did the most, we picked the best possible circumstances for this particular project. And so I think a lot of times we get ourselves into trouble by overlooking risk and not being serious about the way we develop our projects or even bid them, in the case that I was just explaining or suggesting.
So here you are early in the project and you're looking at high level estimates, and you're right. It's troublesome because you're having to look at what might possibly occur and you're not even in planning yet. And this is a trick where we are. And I go back to what I said about 3 or 4 minutes ago. There's the individual risks that will catch when we're in planning, but early in the early estimation, in order to get everybody behind the project, you have to understand a general tendency. How are people going to respond when and if something bad happens? What are people going to do if and when something really good happens? And how do we actually position that so that the project can still move forward unhindered?
Well, I think in a lot of situations, I just kind of described what we did as bidders in competitive situations. But let's say I'm part of an internal organization. My CEO or CIO is still going to require an estimate of what it's going to take to complete the project. So regardless of whether I'm bidding from the outside or working from the inside, there is an estimation process, as you've just described. And I think part of that, where the teams that I've worked with have been able to mitigate some of that risk right up front, is that we provide several assumptions. So for example, one assumption may be, I can do a requirements definition in the time you've requested it. However, I can't do it on my own. So I require 25 of your number one best end users to help me out. So, so we can put in some sort of fencing around what the risk is so that we can kind of mitigate it immediately right from the outset.
Yeah. And we'll talk about sources and categories of risk in here in a little bit, because this is so critical. And we're not just talking, staying on schedule and managing your budget and that kind of thing. It even gets down to the perception of the stakeholders and decision makers on the tendency of the project to have a favorable outcome. That's what risk management is really there. It's to actually guide the people to a sense of confidence that this project is going in the right direction.
And as you were speaking, it just occurred to me that maybe we should just kind of plant a few seeds at the outset here to kind of explain what it is that we mean by risk. What are the elements of risk? I think you brought in overall project risk versus individual risks. What are some of those individual risks that we as project managers should be aware of and be calculating for?
Well, we can go through the traditional knowledge areas. We can look at schedule and scope and cost. What happens if we start getting too many excited stakeholders who want to do everything on that project, the risk of scope creep. Yeah. What happens if we have too many unfavorable things happen? And here we go, we're starting to run out of budget. Are we ready for that? Are we ready to have that conversation? Yeah. Or quality, or contracts. What happens if my contract doesn't take 6 weeks to negotiate, but it takes 4 months? Are we ready to actually prepare people for these things? So you have the different knowledge areas. And then we have the general tendencies of human behavior, right? And this is where I find it fun. Every human being has filters, the habits and the behaviors that we built up over a lifetime. And we end up with these things called biases in our heads. And we have a tendency to look at this thing that way and this thing that way. And we have to know ourselves as project managers really well, but we have to learn about the perceptions and the biases of the stakeholders and teams around us.
Well, even something as simple as going into a project and making an assumption that your customer or your client base is much more risk tolerant than you believe they were.
See, and that's where we get into this more general project risk conversation. And this gets interesting. From project to project, even a single organization is going to have their different ability to tolerate certain types of risk and inability to tolerate others. You have healthcare, they are religious about the whole thing around human safety and around privacy of data.
What we're saying for our audience is that risk can come from anywhere and from all over the place. And for what you have to be you have to be prepared as a project manager to understand where risk can come from and just have some sort of plan in place so that you can mitigate those risks, or in the case of a positive risk, how to take advantage and have a better outcome than was expected. So
this is what I find so interesting. Because of my approach to risk in the last 15 years, I've gotten two common tendencies and two common responses to people I work with. Number one, Tim, you're a damp blanket. Why do you bring in the things that I don't want to think about? And number two, Tim, why are you looking for opportunities in everything? This is not an opportunistic project. This is not a project that's going to, generate profit. Let's just hold our horses here. And it's funny how these responses are coming from people who I would consider experts too. This is not just, team members who are not used to working with a trained project manager.
Well, and in addition to that, you and I have lived a lot of projects along the way. And part of what we have to be aware of is the fact that our past experience informs what could happen. Until you've lived through a project, a major project where the CEO or the senior project manager on the other side has been changed and went from sort of a complacent type project manager to a very aggressive one, from one who had the heart of their end users in mind, the other one who had the next notch in their career belt in mind. I mean, until you've lived some of those experiences, you're not always aware of what could be happening. So some of that experience also comes into play here as we anticipate risk, whether good or bad.
Yeah, exactly. This is what makes our job so interesting. We're having to be, like I said at the beginning of the show, we're having to be those prognosticators, and we have to be very, very careful in how we deliver our forecasts, or people are going to say that's the target, that's the real thing.
That's right.
And we can't allow people to take that leap of faith. I forget who said that, but every time you step in the river is a new event. It's a new you, it's a new river, it's a new water.
Yeah, and I think one of the most interesting things that I have learned about risk is that risk is inevitable. Mm-hmm. It will always be there. And so I think from that perspective, from whether you're a young project manager or a well-seasoned project manager, I think it's the mindset that you establish for yourself to keep that risk within an acceptable range. And so there's two concepts there. You will always have risk, but how do we keep that risk within an acceptable range? You're never going to get it to zero probability.
Yeah.
But you can deal with it within an acceptable range. And I think that's probably the most interesting thing that I have ever learned over my lifetime as a project manager in dealing with risk.
One of the things that I find fascinating is about 10 years ago, I looked back in my career, and I'd been teaching for a decade. And I remember one of my slides says risk is both positive and negative.
Yes.
And I was thinking, okay, is there a project I've ever had that was truly only negative risk, that I could not divulge an opportunity? And I couldn't come up with one. What about you? Have you found one that actually you didn't need to look at opportunities as well?
No, I think, well, the preponderance of risk events tend to be negative, tend to be
Right.
something that you need to mitigate. But no, I have had, and maybe they're serendipitous, maybe they're not, but I have had situations where the result of an event happening ended up being a positive outcome. You and I had talked earlier in the week about this whole COVID, the whole pandemic thing, which seems to be recurring again. But regardless of that, what did that do? It was a very negative thing, potentially. But how many organizations across the world suddenly learned how to use remote facilities to be able to conduct their work and to keep their staff employed?
Yeah, exactly. By that time, I'd been working remotely off and on since 2004. And boy, oh boy, it was really surprising that I looked at everybody else in the entire planet going through the process I did in the first 2 or 3 years. And it was very heartwarming to understand, number one, that what I went through was not uncommon.
Yeah.
And number two, the fact that I actually had some value to share with people. And it really did help us there. And this is what I learned. Going through risk gives us an opportunity to collect lessons learned.
Yeah. And as you were saying that, lessons learned popped to my mind. How often do we collect them and then ignore them? They become shelf help as opposed to something we can use on the next project or furthering along the current project that we're on. It's
Right.
just frustrating to me that lessons learned are there for the taking and we ignore them.
Right. There's the same discipline that allows to manage risk appropriately is also the discipline that lets us take an opportunity from the things that happen from both good and adverse events.
One of the things that experience teaches us, and I think before I mentioned mindset, have a mindset that it's going to happen, something will happen, let's be ready for it. I remember several years ago, I was on a project where right in the middle of the project, our database architect, who was instrumental in doing a lot of good for our project, ended up having a health issue, and I could see it coming. And so immediately, as I saw this occurring, I wasn't sure if it was going to affect her work or not, but it seemed like it might. And so I alerted my superiors, and wouldn't you know it, but a very experienced database architect from another project had just completed their engagement on that project and was free. And so I was able to bring that person on board to assist with what could happen with my original database architect, who did take a leave of absence, but we never lost stride. Now, that was an unexpected event. It was negative. It was a risk that we could have been watching from a personnel standpoint. But I don't think it was particularly serendipitous. I think from experience in the past, my superiors and myself were able to put a plan together to have someone delivered to the project who could handle the situation after the first person left. And I think from that perspective, we're always looking for ways to make sure that should an event occur, we can take care of it.
And it doesn't have to be flowery. It doesn't have to cost $100,000.
Right.
What it has to do is appropriate for the nature of the risk and the potential impact that you'll have.
And so what is, I was thinking too, I've been in situations where the hardware that we ordered was delivered late, or a software upgrade from a software provider ended up causing us to have to redo work that was already in place because some things were no longer compatible with the upgrade. So all of these things that happen, how is it that we can be prepared for those? I think that's the question that most project managers have to deal with.
Yeah. And that's, that's where risk has to be a real major component of your change management. As you're going through these changes and putting these change requests into your configuration management and observing, the potential results. This is the finest opportunity you can have for actually not predicting per se, but estimating, what could that possibly happen. The best people on change control boards are the people who are sitting back and this observation of risk is constantly occurring.
Oh, that what you just said there is so critical, because I've again been on projects where those people in the change control board knew what else was going on besides just on the project.
Yes.
And so if someone suggests a change, or as a result of a risk, we have to make a change, they're aware of the entire sort of enterprise and how that can affect the enterprise, not just the project. So yeah, that is critical to have those change control board people who are well aware of everything that's going on.
This is where management of projects start becoming fascinating. You think that as you go and become a program manager, you pull back and you're creating new benefits out of the group of projects. You think that's when you're actually starting to, get closer and closer to business. But it also happens as you work more and more with your decision makers and your executives, just in project management. This is a necessary understanding. Most of the risk identification really early in your projects must come from things like enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets.
So earlier you had talked about project risk versus specific or individual risks. And we kind of touched on the individual risk to kind of give our audience an understanding of what we're talking about. But can you kind of expand on that, where you have an individual risk over here, an individual risk over here, et cetera, et cetera. How can we as project managers look at those and think of project risk as a whole at the same time?
So there's two ways. First of all, it's a top-down analysis. You're looking at your enterprise, you're looking at the external influences, and these are general influences that are not just things that are going on to impact your project, but impacting the corporation, impacting the community, and so forth, like COVID. And then you start looking at the individual risks as people are starting to go into the activity discovery and looking at the individual things. And then what you can do is, keeping in mind this general overarching bunch of things that are going on and looking at the individual risks, there's a way to actually combine all of them, but it takes a little bit of math. You have to get everything to a common unit, and then you can combine them.
Yeah, I think some of the experiences I've had, I've been in situations where individual risks themselves, they have, they could do minor setbacks to your project, but they weren't particularly consequential to the overall project. And so from an experiential point of view, someone may panic at the sight of any risk. But at the same time, an experienced person can look and say, well, we're going to mitigate that, but it's not going to affect my project much. But I've got 5 more like it coming at the same time. Now I've got a problem.
Exactly. And I've had just the opposite experience as well, where I actually broke down these risks into a scale of probability and impact so I could get a single number on these. And adding up all the numbers, I could see the general threat. And then looking at all these individual risks, I could see, wow, that risk is over half of my project risk. This is something for me to pay attention to.
Yeah. Maybe something I have to assign a resource to full time just to be able to deal with it, manage it, mitigate it. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. And everybody's afraid of math, but once you start understanding this, that it's not math, math is just a tool that allows you to talk about things you don't have, the regular oral words for. It actually becomes a very, very usable tool.
So it does. And, we have a little bit of time here, and I just want to go back to something I had brought forward earlier, and maybe it's germane to this particular conversation. And that is with the risk tolerance, or the acceptable range of risk calculation that my customer, my stakeholders can deal with. So is there something along the lines of what we're talking about, project versus individual risk, and also how to sort of temper those with the risk tolerance of my stakeholders?
So yeah, there's two things we can do, and we won't get into rewards or opportunities. Let's just talk about threats.
Yes.
And so there's two things. There's tolerance and there's threshold. Okay. And tolerance says, I am prepared for these risks. I have set aside time and or money, and I can allow that many risks to happen. Like you have a couple trucks that you're using for 12 weeks of construction in a city, right? And there's a 15% chance you'll have two such events where a truck might get up to $7,000 worth of damages, right? And so what you can do is you can set aside either a personal account or take out insurance as a response. And that means that you can tolerate those risks. You can basically say those risks are taken care of to the best of my current ability. I'll come back and assess this later. So that's tolerance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's threshold. Threshold's a little trickier. It's a line in your risk that says, based on what I've discovered with my stakeholders, here are the risks I got to pay attention to. Here are the risks I can accept for now. It basically says that's the line. Now, that line may change. That line may change for many reasons, because the time for certain risks to occur may have gone by. We no longer will have that type of risk happen. Or we're getting up to a part of the project where the work we're going to do is a little more risky. And all of a sudden, that time, those risks are going to go real high. And so this actually becomes almost an art form of where you're managing this like an ebb of flow of this threshold and this tolerance. And the thing is, if you do this enough, and if you make forecasts and miss a few of them, you start learning this, and this becomes a normal habit where you start getting these hunches.
Well, and I want to go back to your truck example, because I thought that was a good one, where, and again, along the line of learning as you go along. So let's say I, as a project manager, am very astute, and I put aside that insurance or that extra cash to deal with $7,000 worth of damage and the 15% probability that could happen. On my second project, I will learn that that was not enough. I also need to account for the downtime, the loss of productivity because of the downtime. So now I'm learning as I go along, right? So it's one of those things where, yes, there's risk tolerance, my stakeholders have a say, but at the same time, experience is always something that we weigh into our project estimates and what could happen.
This is, I always wondered why these senior project managers who are really good are quiet and introspective during certain times in the project. And I caught myself saying, I need to capture this. This is really important. I'm going to be using this in the future.
But the other side of what you just said too is that I, as a junior project manager, watching what they're doing, also have the obligation that if something is coming along my way I need to have them mentor me along the way. I need to ask their advice. What would you do in this situation? And wait for them to say, oh, by the way, have you thought about the downtime that's going to happen with one of those trucks out of commission?
You know, I feel almost like I have to give permission for project managers to work together.
Yeah.
When I have a bunch of project managers who've never gone through formal training, I make that as a 15-minute topic. You know, we as project managers have this sense to us that we have to be lone wolves and we have to handle this by ourselves. But it's always best to have somebody to bounce ideas from. And I'm not just talking about having mentors. I carry 2 to 3 mentees at the same time, usually throughout a year. And I bounce ideas off of them too. And, you know, these things that we capture that are lessons learned are not just lessons learned from, 10 or 20 years of managing projects. It's just common sense.
Actually, the common sense, that's more than just common sense, because the persons that you are asking for advice from, even if they're more junior, as we define junior on projects, they're the ones who are closest to the actual activity that's going on. And they're the ones who can sense the risk and warn us ahead of time before we, as project managers, sort of one step back, one step removed from the problem before we can even see it. And so what you just said is exactly right. Mentors with senior people, but also listen to those people who are on the ground with their ear to the activity that's happening around them.
Oh, I have learned through being knocked around on many projects that I cannot afford not to listen to people, even people that it's tough for me to be around. We all have that. And you cannot afford to just check out on somebody and say, oh, that person knows nothing. No, they know something that you need, possibly even right this moment.
And that also goes for our stakeholders. Some of the best advice and some of the best mitigation efforts I have ever had on a project are because of a warning or something that came from my stakeholder who saw something before I did. So we need to always have our antenna up and listen to those people around us.
Let's get back to planning risk, and let's talk about how you plan risk. We have this risk planning that happens. It happens when you're helping the project get approved, and when you're starting to build out the schedule. So how do you go about discovering risk? I know you just said, we take the advice of people around us. What else do you gather, and where do you look for risk?
A lot of times I go back to those lessons learned that I said a little bit earlier that so many projects ignore. And if it happened on that project, I need to watch for it on this project. If it's one of those kinds of lessons. So there are certain lessons that we can learn, certain things that happen from project to project that are, if not inevitable, at least higher in probability, that we can start to watch for, that we can start to manage for from the outset of the project. So I think that's one place that I look for right there, is from past project experience, and taking that past project experience and sort of lifting it and putting it into my current enterprise environment to see how it may be affected within the current environment. That's one. I don't, if you got other ones.
2 or 3. The first one is like you. I have 2 or 3 templates and checklists that I use. Am I considering this? Am I looking at federal government? Am I looking at, local government? Am I looking for the relationship between the company and the community? Am I looking at what the organization is doing with the impacted organizations already? What's going on in and around this project and the project environment? And then on top of that, I've found that a series and a sequence of surveys followed up with interviews. It takes time and it can be complicated, but done in a planned manner can actually lay out not just, the risk, but also things like gathering requirements. And for all that's worth, gathering requirements is, in a sense, also gathering, things that could actually impact the project for better or worse.
Well, that's really important because, again, there's opportunity in the planning aspects of a project around risk to deal with our stakeholders because they need to have their input in the project. And so it's a good time to have that initial conversation around risk and see what they're seeing from their perspective. Maybe they can only give me their staff on a 20% basis. So for some projects, that could be a huge risk because I'm looking for 80% productivity. So there's things like that initially we begin to have those conversations so that we can begin the management and the mitigation early. You'd mentioned the federal government earlier, because I've done so many projects that had federal government as sponsor. Often we learned, when I was part of a large organization, we learned to have people who would anticipate or actually look for bills that were coming before the legislative body that were in draft form so that we could quickly scan those to see what effect they may have on our project as we're progressing. And several times that has saved our bacon because we could anticipate what's coming and make a course correction to pick up that new legislation or that change early on. So yeah, it's things that we learn from past experience and bring them on to every project.
Every relationship has incredible value. I was through silly luck. I actually developed a relationship with our lobbyist for a multinational corporation I worked for, and he and I continued conversations outside of our activities. And this actually, when I was working with fellow travelers to my company, this actually not only did impress the fellow travelers I was working with, but it also gave them a sense of confidence that we were sort of plugged in. We had the information we needed, and we could actually work not just as a project team, but as a business team to make sure what we wanted to do had the greatest chance of occurring.
Yeah, because your sponsors don't want you to fail either. They want you to succeed. I had a similar situation to what you just described. I had befriended a person who was involved, who was part of the sponsorship team. I had befriended that person over, I'd say 2 or 3 projects over sort of several years, and ended up working on a project in my home state that clearly was bid with a lack of fund, or was about to be bid out, but I could tell it was lacking in funding. And something stirred within me that I remembered a conversation with my friend in the sponsoring agency. And I went back to that person and said, you mentioned something earlier, is this kind of funding available for this kind of project? And he said, absolutely. And so we were able to take our executives from our project and the sponsoring organization, put them together, come up with a plan. And as a result of that, we were able to up the funding requirements and get much better bids for the project. But again, it was because we set up that relationship. There was a huge risk in terms of lack of funding, but because in this case, I had my antenna up, we were able to mitigate that early on before it ever became a risk.
Very good. Very good. Yes. The relationships you build are a great contributor to your success not just on your projects, but in your career.
Haven't we talked about that, Ed, many times on this project? Relationships and human factors. Project management revolves around that.
So here we go. We've talked about planning. Let's talk about monitoring, controlling. How do you schedule the time to actually say, now I'm going to, go and assess my risks and make changes to the probability and impact, and update my status and update my dashboard? Or is it something that's just built in to the normal cadence of how you go about day to day?
In my experience, it's both. One is we absolutely have, if not bi-weekly, at least weekly review of everything that's on the table. We look at every single risk. Now, there may be a lot of risks, and if there's some that have a low probability, low impact, we may not even bring those to the table at the time unless there's something has changed. But every single week, we would go through every risk that had high probability and high impact to the project to make sure that whoever was assigned, the specific person responsible for that risk, was taking into account how to manage it and potentially how to mitigate it, or in the case of an opportunity, how to take advantage of that opportunity. But no, what you just said, we did absolutely religiously every week. And more often as things change, sometimes we would have to call an emergency meeting because something may have changed between the two meetings that we had to deal with right away. So in answer to your question, both.
Yeah.
Both.
And I'm the same. There would be the time that we need to do a full canvas on a regular cadence, and it says we are looking at risk. We are all consciously spending time on risk, and we'll look at the other elements later. And then every time I open up the risk register, because I'm thinking, did I really get that right? What did we say? Whenever I open up the risk register, I tell myself, this is an opportunity to make small adjustments. It's just like opening up the stakeholder register. This is an opportunity to make adjustments, or opening up the assumptions log. This is an opportunity. So it's built on, extra work, but at the same time, it's built on continuing, to step forward and get more clarity.
Well, and the other thing is we time box those meetings. And by time boxing them, it forced us to stay on focus on the most relevant ones that were before us. The other thing, though, we did was we gave permission for those people who were responsible for any risk, even if it was right down at the bottom of the priority order. If something changed in their world and they needed to alert us, they had permission to bring that low priority into a high priority for discussion. So we're always taking a look at those risks from a priority and a recency. No, is that a good word?
Immediacy.
Immediacy, yeah, from an immediacy perspective, always.
Yeah.
And by the way, our client or our stakeholders were in those meetings with us.
Yeah. This is something that we have to remember, and I actually learned this when we were going from the 5th edition of the PMBOK to the 6th edition of the PMBOK. There was a small statement, and I don't know if it's still there, but I really believe in its relevance. Risk and quality management are two areas of project management where you as a project manager can demonstrate the value of your role and demonstrate the value of project management itself. You can say, see, this is why you need me. See, this is why doing projects this way is valuable. It's education, awareness, and marketing at its best.
This is why we have methodologies, right?
Exactly. This is why. This risk is exactly why we manage risk and why I'm careful. It's a great training opportunity.
Back to what we just talked about, though, in terms of do we do this weekly or whatever. The other part of that, I think, is that we keep our documentation very, very strategic. Besides the description, I think you mentioned, as we go along and discuss a risk week after week, we take notes so that we can see kind of what happened from the time the risk was first looked at or discovered to how we're dealing with it on a weekly or more often basis, so that we know exactly what's happening. But then also what we would often include in that estimation was what is the appropriate basis of how we will mitigate this risk? In other words, how much effort are we going to spend on trying to mitigate this risk? You could say we're going to take this risk down to nothing and spend way more money on the effort to mitigate it than it would have cost us had we just let it happen.
See, this is the art, and this is where, your estimation has to be within that optimal range. Are we managing this risk for the success of the project, for a successful outcome, to make the objective? Or are we doing the risk just for the sake of doing risk?
Right.
I hate to say this, but that it's just like quality, and it's just like other aspects of project management. You can actually do this to an extent of the project is more about managing risk than creating the deliverable.
Yeah, and people can get carried away with that. People who are, bound to sort of their checklists. I did this right. This is exactly what I'm doing. This is what my methodology tells me. Sometimes we'll forget about the appropriateness of handling that risk within the tolerance level of our stakeholders.
See, and this is a beautiful circuitous route back to what we said earlier. Understanding that general project risk and the relationship, the general size of individual risks to the project risk itself. It really helps you and understand, am I really spending my time appropriately? If this is like 75% of my general risk, yeah, I'm going to be talking about that every day. But if it's like 3 to 5%, but I have some very vocal stakeholders who are really either critical or concerned about this, I can actually reset expectations, doing the math and going back and looking at notes and giving calm conversation and help them build confidence, over the path that we built to where we are, to reset their expectations on the importance of this risk.
Well, and that's where that human touch is so important. So many people say, well, I sent an email. No. Did you sit down with your stakeholder? Did you explain to them? Did you watch the expressions on their face? Did you get the feel for how concerned they were, or whether or not you were able to alleviate their concern? So you don't often see that in an email. And so to me, my preference is that I maintain that constant touch on a daily basis with my stakeholders.
Oh yeah. There's that constant interaction. This is like I said, this is an art. It's first learned with checklists and watching others, but then as you build the experience and turn these into habits, that's where you see these very senior project managers going off of hunches. It's not just a hunch for a hunch's sake. It's a hunch based on, I have seen this before, or I have done similar things, or I remember a friend 15 years ago who told me something.
Yeah. Oh, you're using that software vendor. Well, were you aware that they only update their code 3 times a year? So you have to be aware that there's going to be some major impacts this month, and this month. And we suffered that on the last project. I don't want to happen on this. So you're always aware of something that's going on around you.
Exactly.
So if I were to advise a listener who is kind of breaking into the project management ranks, I think, what you just said and what I'm kind of getting to, I think these are things that a young project manager can sort of sink their teeth into. One is, to me, that risk is always present. It will never not be present. Just be prepared for it. Don't be scared about it, and just kind of understand that there are ways to handle it, whether it's a threat or an opportunity.
And any formal training that's worth its participation will have some very actionable guidance
Yeah.
on planning for risk, estimating risk, forecasting risks, monitoring, controlling, developing responses, and turn them into checklists as you're in that class. Their first outlines, then turn them into checklists that you can turn into templates. And you're going to have some things that you can actually, work with and experience and think about as you go through the projects you're on right this moment.
And if the company or the organization that you're supporting has a risk methodology in place, learn it, use it.
There's
Take
a reason.
yeah.
There's a reason why they have that in place.
And I think the other thing that we talked about that is real important is even if it's not mentorship, it's just sort of like, don't be afraid to ask for advice in a situation where you see a risk situation sort of beginning to bubble up. Don't be afraid to ask for advice from senior people. Don't be afraid to ask for advice from those people who are on the ground right in the middle of or the thick of things.
Yeah, and something like that, either that is an issue, it's happening right now, or is a risk. It has a potential for occurring.
Yeah.
They're bad things. And a lot of us don't like to talk about bad topics. And a lot of organizational cultures are like, we don't talk about bad things. But it's your role as a project manager to expose those in a careful, compassionate way such that you can get it out on the table, assess it, and working with people as a group, use your understanding to at least determine the appropriateness of any response that'll help the project and the organization.
Well, I've always said if we could predict that every project will run smoothly, they don't need us. They would not need us.
Yeah, and that's not going to happen for quite a few decades.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and land this. Where can we find you this next week? Oh, we're going to be out for a week or two, aren't we?
Yeah, we are, but that's all right.
Yeah, and so where can we interact with you if we have questions or we want to make comments on what we're talking about?
You can find me on LinkedIn.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
And myself too. I'll communicate them through LinkedIn.
So until next time.
Sounds good, Merv. Thanks again, everyone.
All right, bye.